We would sit at the table and, I would want to catch up, what's going on, learn about New York, and everybody's just talking about the food all the time. And I was like, please stop, this is embarrassing.
When Montreal native Kim Kushner moved to Manhattan, she quickly realized that her cooking skills were special, and knowing how to cook was not common amongst her peers. After graduating from culinary school, Kim became a private chef for some of New York City's most discerning eaters and taught cooking classes out of her apartment. 3 cookbooks later, this Queen of Kosher redefined kosher cooking and was featured in the International New York Times, Huffington Post, Chicago Tribune, and appeared on the Today Show.
Everything about my childhood comes back to being in the kitchen or being around the dining room table. All of my best memories are eating or being surrounded by food and people. My mom did everything herself in the kitchen and we watched. I never really cooked until I was living on my own. I came to New York for a wedding. I was invited to a wedding and I met John at the wedding and we started dating long distance, and then he proposed and we got married in Montreal, and then I moved to New York, and that was my first time really living outside of the house. From the moment I moved to New York, I was always cooking and I was always having friends over. And that's actually how this all started, that we would have friends over, whether for drinks and dinner or Shabbats, and nobody could believe that, wow, you made this, this is homemade, you didn't order in, we need to order, all we eat is ordered in food. And I said, no, we don't order in, I cook every night, and it's simple, and they couldn't believe it. And that's when I realized that, wow, not everybody cooks. That was an eye-opener for me. I grew up in such a community and a family that was all about food, and my mom still today is bringing the neighbors food. And I spoke to her this morning. She's like, I'm on my bike making my deliveries. I made cookies this morning. I'm bringing to my friend this, and my neighbor here, and my friend is not well. And just I never I took for granted that everything was homemade,
right,
and that we would eat these delicious, comforting meals night after night, day after day.
When do you realize that not only do you cook, because that's already a differentiating factor, but I'm a good cook? When does that first kick in?
I have to say, I would invite people over and it would be embarrassing because we would sit at the table and I would want to catch up, what's going on, learn about New York, and everybody's just talking about the food all the time. And I was like, please stop, this is embarrassing. But I guess that's when I realized, and somebody once said to me, can I get a group of friends over and can you teach us how to make this? And I said, of course. And so that was the first time I taught anybody how to cook. It was a group of 4 women friends who came over and we made couscous together.
Wow.
And that's really one thing led to the next, and I got a phone call a few days later. I heard you taught them how to make this. Can you teach me how? And one thing led to the next, and I started teaching cooking classes out of my apartment. I ended up enrolling in a full-time culinary program. At the same time, this was encouraging me to be hosting and cooking and inviting more people over. When you graduate culinary school, you have to do an externship somewhere, well, at least with this school. And I ended up working at Food and Wine magazine. It was supposed to be, I think, 6 weeks, and I stayed for 6 months. And I loved it. And then I continued on to a different food magazine, developing recipes and researching food and writing food articles, and it was great.
And so after 6 months, what happened?
So after 6 months, I decided that I was going to try to do private chef work. And so I put out, I guess through the school, you can put out an ad, and I said, I was available to do private chef work, and it was New York. It was 2004, I think. So it was booming, and everybody needed a chef, and it was very easy to find work. And so I started working for a family on the Upper East Side, very close to where I lived. And it was a very interesting, humbling experience that I loved. And I was working domestically with the other domestic workers in the home, and it was about learning about people and being part of a team. And while I was doing this private chef work, it dawned upon me, because I would be in the kitchen cooking and the other people who worked would come and they would want to learn and tell me how to make that. I'm going to go home and make it for my family. And I was like, wow, I think I'm onto something. And I decided that because I was still teaching cooking classes, like how cool would it be to start teaching these people who are domestic workers, so nannies and housekeepers, teaching them how to cook. And so I started giving seminars that were cooking lessons that were twice a week or 3 times a week. And I would market it to the employer who had hired these people to work in their home. And I would say, do you want to send these people to learn? And they'll come home at the end of the week and they'll have 20 new, fresh, simple recipes. And they were like, sure. So I did it for about 2 years. And then when I realized, the nights, it was weeknights, it was not weekends. And when I realized, I want to be home with my husband and I was ready to start a family, that's when I stopped doing that and I continued with the cooking lessons.
So now take us to your first cookbook.
And at the end of every class, they would say, you need to write a book, you need to write a book. Yeah.
Up until this point, have you been writing down all your recipes,
all of my recipes,
or have you had some in your head? Everything's written?
Everything's written down. And what I realized was, I have the recipes. I just need to create the book for the recipes. Right. I'm not gonna, scramble now for the next year to figure out. I know these recipes are tried and true. I've been teaching them, I've been cooking them, they've been passed down, I've been tweaking them. So now I need to put together a book. I knew what I wanted to do, because at that point, we had a lot of kosher cookbooks, but the kosher cookbooks did not look like the non-kosher cookbooks.
Right.
And I was like, and I cook from regular cookbooks that aren't kosher, and I just tweak. For me, I've always just been kosher. It's nothing I've ever thought about. It's nothing I've ever dwelled, I just happen to be kosher. So I'll take a recipe, I'll look at it, and I'll be like, okay, I need to change this to me. It's going to work for me. I'm not going to use the butter in the steak. I'm going to use olive oil instead, and we're done. So it bothered me up until then that I love cookbooks, and I've always collected cookbooks, but why don't the kosher cookbooks look like these gorgeous other books? And so I decided that I wanted to create a great, beautiful, amazing cookbook that just happened to be kosher. And I received a phone call and they said, hi, we're a publishing house out of Tel Aviv. We heard about you. We heard you're working on a book. We'd love to publish it.
How did they hear about you?
I guess through the blog and through, just word of mouth. And I said, okay, well, I have this project. If you want to keep it as it is, I'd love for you to publish it. And they took the disc and they printed the book and they published it exactly as it was. So this was the first book, and I didn't want to put kosher in the title. So I called it The Modern Menu, Simple, Beautiful Kosher in the subtitle. And there was nothing like this in a kosher, nothing like this in the kosher food world at that time, just white pages and very, very clear. The recipes are just written so clearly.
Were you modeling it off any specific cookbooks that you liked?
I was modeling it off more food magazines and editorial spreads and how those looked, like glossy, shiny, popping off the pages, and keeping it very simple. I had learned how to write a recipe, and I also didn't want, and I still, even in all 3 of my books, I didn't want very, very long lists of ingredients. Like, I wanted to show that if you just have a few ingredients, you could still make a beautiful recipe that is approachable. My husband was very funny. He would always keep a box in the car, and anywhere he went, anytime he saw a bookstore or a type of store that he thought would suit it, he would go in and say, take 2 of these books. If they sell, here's my number, you can call me. And people would take it. And I followed his lead. And I started going to, like in Manhattan, to Eli's, Zabar's is a very well-known gourmet specialty food store. And I was in there one day and the owner, Eli, walked in and I said to him, hi, how are you? My name is Kim. I just wrote a great kosher cookbook, and I know that, I think it was like Hanukkah or one of the holidays was coming up where they do a display. And I said, you'll love my book. And he said, okay, bring a few over. And he looked at it and he said, why don't we do an event? And we did a big event for this cookbook in his store, and there were hundreds of people, and it got some media, got some buzz. And from then I thought, I had only been thinking bookstores, but specialty food stores, kitchen stores, that's where people buy books.
Right.
So I brought the book to Williams-Sonoma, which is a kitchen store, and they said, oh, we've never had a kosher book before. And I said, you know, the holiday's coming, it's a great gift. And the manager loved the book, and he said, let me call corporate. And they sold the book. It was the first kosher title they ever sold. And I didn't know, but Williams-Sonoma works very tightly. They have their own publishing house, or they work tightly with a publishing house. And they then reached out to me and said, if you want to do another book, we've never done a kosher title before, we'd love to do your book. And so they did my second book, which is The New Kosher. The first book got a lot of publicity. I did a bunch of morning shows with the first book. I had heard that there was a Jewish Orthodox girl working at the Today Show. And so I dropped off my book with biscotti, my homemade biscotti, and she put me on the show. And I did a bunch of the morning shows in Canada, in California. I went to LA. I did a lot of those shows. In New York, I did a bunch of shows as well. But the Today Show was like a big break for me. Yeah. So
why did you decide to write the second cookbook?
I had so much demand for it. That's really why that was the push. People said to me, we love it, we love it.
How did you come up with the title for that?
What I had realized was that I was very tired of people thinking of kosher food. People thought of kosher food as Jewish cuisine. Jewish cuisine is knishes, pastrami, corned beef, matzah ball soup. That's Jewish cuisine.
But it's really people, Ashkenazic.
Yeah, right. And people weren't able to differentiate between kosher and Jewish. Now, kosher is just dietary laws and dietary restrictions. And what I wanted to show is like, it's enough of us always cooking the same. The kosher cookbooks had so much of the same style recipes. And I wanted to show that like, this is time for a new kosher, a new way of looking at kosher.
So you were kind of making kosher cool, like enlightening the world on this is not, like there was a misconception about what kosher meant.
Right. I think that there was a misconception. I think there still is, but less so. And, you know, I have a lot of friends who are Jewish or not Jewish, kosher, not kosher. And I remember my neighbor once came over for a meal, and as he was eating the food, he goes to me, this is kosher? And I said to him, what does that mean? He goes, I don't know. I didn't expect kosher to taste like this. And I was like, kosher can be anything, you know? And instead of so many of us focus on what we can't eat, you know, all the good things we can't eat. But for me, I've never thought about what I can't eat. I think about there's so much I can eat. And even the products that exist today, the kosher market is really gourmet. I mean, in this community in itself is an amazing example of taking it to the next level. Unbelievable. This didn't exist, you know, 10 years ago or 15 years ago when I started.
You then wrote a third cookbook.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For the third book, the same publishing house, Weldon Owen, reached out and they wanted to do another book. And I shot the book actually here out of my house here. And I used all my props and my family's in it, and it was a great project, and it's done really well also, and it continues to sell. So the last book has sold the most, and each one has almost doubled in the amount of sales.
Wow!
But the beauty of a book is that it doesn't really have an expiration date.
Right.
So people, you know, even if you wrote the book 2 years ago and you hear buzz about it. You know, I cook from a cookbook that my mother has had for 40 years. You know, if it's a good book, it will last the test of time.
What drives you?
I think for me, it's the creativity. I need to be creative. It's a passion. So I love eating, I love cooking, but more than anything else, I love feeding other people. And I say this a lot, especially now we can understand more than ever. In a time when you feel helpless, I feel like in my life, there's been many moments that have been amazing and, you know, ups and downs, but no matter what, whether it's high or low, at the end of the day, we all need to eat. And so that's, for me, it's a comfort. It's therapeutic that when I don't know what else to do, you know, when I'm realized, oh, I'm going to be stuck home for 4 months. I'm not going to the supermarket. I have a fridge of food and what's left in it. Well, let me see what I can make. Let me see how I can feed my neighbor. Let me see how I can help the hospital workers. My language, you know, I feel like I speak best through food. And, you know, I've had people in my life who have gone through very difficult times. I don't need to say anything. I'll bring something, and that's enough.